Guillermo Del Toro is one of the more imaginative and creative directors working today. He's dabbled in notable horror movies, action movies and fantasy films like Pan's Labyrinth, Hellboy, The Devil's Backbone and recently the Oscar-winning The Shape of Water. It's always worth keeping an eye out for which project Del Toro will pick up next, but it's this very thing which is the source of so much frustration from his fans, because you lose count of the amount of times Del Toro has announced a new film only for it to fall through and not go ahead. He's actually becoming more famous for the films he hasn't made than the ones he has. The recent Pacific Rim sequel, for example, was originally helmed by Del Toro, and after many delays and many promises that the movie would start filming in the next couple of weeks, suddenly he was no longer a part of the project. Of course, things can change and no one knows the future, and the reason for projects of his not going ahead will be different to each other individually. But it has come to a point where if Del Toro reveals his new project, fans will no longer get hyped, because there's a very real chance that the movie won't be made. In a way, I kind of see it from Del Toro's point of view. He's like a giddy child sometimes, and when a studio okays one of his pitches, he excitedly tells everyone left, right and centre when the project hasn't even begun production, or even started forecasting financial projections. And you also have to remember that sometimes movie announcements are done to test the waters, and enough hype can actually get a film made, Deadpool for example. Still though, Del Toro's fans must be among the most unfulfilled bunch of film fans around. A lot of the movies he was going to helm, like Blade 3, Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban and The Hobbit, were passed on to different directors. I'm more concerned in this video of the ones that haven't been made full stop. Most of them seem to come from a multi-film deal that Del Toro signed with Universal in 2009. Getting the big one out of the way, At the Mountain of Madness. This was a real heartbreaker that it wasn't made, for Del Toro as much as any of us. He mentioned when the studio cancelled it, he went home and cried a little to himself. In around 2010, the ambitious H.P. Lovecraft adaptation had magnificently secured an R rating, Tom Cruise as the lead, James Cameron as the producer, and incredibly a $200 million budget, before the studio suddenly got cold feet and pulled the plug on the whole thing. The fact that Ridley Scott's Prometheus was a similar film and had a lukewarm reception is thought to be one of the main reasons for the studio in having second thoughts. Del Toro was unwilling to compromise his vision, which included no love story, no happy ending, and shooting the whole film on location, which was rejected by 3 different studios. Mountain of Madness is the most well-known of Del Toro's what might have been projects. The story is a celebrated tale of horror concerning an expedition to Antarctica which leads to the discovery of a hidden city, created by a race of creepy creatures. Think something along the lines of John Carpenter's The Thing, but on heavy crack and steroids. If they pulled it off, it would have been Del Toro's magnum opus, but to the cries of thousands of fans it was cancelled in what Del Toro describes as a horrible miscarriage. Next, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Again, after seeing the horror dripping from Del Toro's filmography, an adaptation of Frankenstein seems like a perfect fit for Del Toro. He was in love with the original novel and was adamant that his film would be a period piece faithful to the novel and focusing on themes of isolation and tragedy, with Benedict Cumberbatch on board to play the monster. But like with Mountain of Madness, this intriguing sounding project just never happened, being superseded by I, Frankenstein. Maybe Universal will approach Del Toro to helm a new version in their current monster shared universe, but if that's the case, it seems unlikely that he will have the creative control he requires to make a good film. Going off of Universal's failed franchise starters, Dracula Untold and The Mummy. Another adaptation that Del Toro wanted to do, which he considers to be very similar to Frankenstein, was an adaptation of Pinocchio. You might be thinking, what the hell, given the definitive version is currently a Disney cartoon movie, but those who have read the book will tell you that it's incredibly sadistic and disturbing, with Pinocchio being subjected to numerous torturous situations. Del Toro spoke about how his version would have Pinocchio being hung, having his legs burned, and the Pleasure Island segment being terrifying. The film was to be done in stop motion using the technique from films like A Nightmare Before Christmas, with Del Toro talking about it for years, recently trying to get it off the ground with Amazon Studios, but he has been resigned to the fact that it isn't happening. Stop motion is frightfully time consuming and thus expensive, and it's thought that the financial failure of Paranorman scared the big studios away from the project. Drude is another film that was touted as potentially becoming one of Del Toro's better movies. He has had previous experience with period pieces, and it would have been interesting seeing him tackle a drama with little to no horror elements in the adaptation of Dan Simmons' partly fiction novel of Charles Dickens' later life. He approached Universal about it in 2009 and it was slated for production in 2012, but again unluckily for Del Toro it just never happened. Possibly due to the failure of similar projects like The Invisible Woman, or perhaps because Universal did not make a horrendous amount of cash from the likes of Hellboy 2 or later Crimson Peak, so they have chosen to tread wisely with Del Toro. Creepy butlers, dark corridors and delightfully gothic atmosphere is what we might have had Del Toro's The Haunted Mansion been made. A previous movie exists, a mediocre Eddie Murphy comedy where Disney were looking to capitalize on Pirates of the Caribbean success from its inception as a theme park ride. Del Toro took his family to see the movie and found it to be a missed opportunity and wanted to make it right, making a spooky horror story which could remove the comedic elements of the first movie. It was discussed in 2010 at Comic-Con, but where is it? Again, this one has just seemingly fizzled away into non-existence. Yet another promising sounding movie that we'll probably never see. The classic book Slaughterhouse V was also on the cards for Del Toro, a crazy novel about a man unstuck in time, living through World War II, post-World War II, and then in an alien planet where he's kept in a zoo. It already has an adaptation that failed commercially. Guillermo wanted to make the film focusing on the idea of what it means to be human, and sought Charlie Kaufman, writer of Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind and Being John Malkovich, to pen the screenplay. The delay and demise of this project was the busy schedules of both Del Toro and Kaufman, the latter of whom had become a director himself. Del Toro said on it, "It's just a catch-22. The studio will make it when it's my next movie, but how can I commit it to being my next movie until there is a screenplay? Charlie Kaufman is a very expensive writer." And since 2011, there has been no serious word on this movie. Another project was Justice League Dark, a DC Comics series that was part of the New 52 reboot in 2011, having a lot more gothic and darker tone than the usual Justice League fare. Warner Brothers officially announced Del Toro as the director of a Justice League Dark movie in 2013, and it would be part of the DC movie universe to be released in 2017. But of course we're in 2018 now, and the DC cinematic universe is all over the place really, with their surefire hits like Batman vs Superman and Justice League flopping critically and not making the bucks they expected. So it's very unlikely that they will go ahead and make an even more left-field movie, especially since the moody tone is one of the most criticized elements of the DC movie universe. And lastly, a picture many fans have been waiting eagerly for, the final piece in his Hellboy trilogy. The first movie was successful enough to warrant a sequel, but Hellboy 2 did not do well enough for another film to be produced immediately. Unfortunately for Del Toro and his fans, Hellboy is just not a big enough draw for the studios to commit to a third entry. The big budget required has stalled the movie's birth, and with Ron Perlman hitting 70, it looks like the peak time for Hellboy 3 has passed and it isn't going to happen. There are loads of other projects too that Del Toro was attached to, like a Tarzan movie and a remake of The Witches that never ended up happening. Too many when you consider he's only made 10 films. I feel with a lot of the projects he's quite unlucky that the studios haven't gambled on him often. And there's many projects where the idea of his creative touch being a part of it is tantalizing. But his films just don't seem to make enough money. And that's what counts in Hollywood for the kind of projects he eyes up. Perhaps making the scale smaller like he did with The Shape of Water is the way forward. He's hoping the fact that the movie won Best Picture will open more doors for him. He's one of the more exciting filmmakers working today, when he is working, and I look forward to seeing what he cooks up in the future, though the aforementioned movies are enough evidence to not hold your breath when a new Del Toro film is announced, because it might yet just be another heartbreak. Thanks for watching.